Hi guys, my name is Izzy and I can't be here because I'm having surgery, but my presentation is about aviation security, specifically in the context of 9/11. So I'm assuming that everybody in this class knows what happened on 9/11 and has a basic understanding of how airport security in the US works today. So what I'm going to talk about instead is why we failed to prevent 9/11, how well aviation security is doing today, how we might improve it, and whether all of the things that we've done are worth it. So, like me, who is about 4 years old in this 2001 picture, many of us are too young to remember how airport security worked on 9/11. So, I'm going to start with some background about that. The FAA was in charge of setting and enforcing aviation security regulations, but airlines were the ones responsible for carrying out airport security, and they usually hired contractors to do so. The FAA system was actually called the Civil Aviation Security System, and it had 7 basic steps, and the first of which was intelligence. And the goal is to identify threats to aviation security long before they actualize. But a major issue was that the FAA wasn't a member of the intelligence community. They had their own intelligence division, which probably was not the best equipped. That being said, even the larger domestic intelligence agencies failed to identify the threat on 9/11 because they couldn't share their information with each other. This was especially true in the case of the FBI and the CIA, who were separated by an intelligence wall. In fact, the CIA had been tracking the hijackers but lost them when they reached the US, whereas the FBI had been investigating them within the United States but didn't know that they were confirmed members of Al Qaeda. Had they known this, they probably would have handled things a lot differently. In addition to the failure to share information, the 9/11 Commission actually blamed a lack of imagination for the failures of the FAA and other intelligence agencies. In 1998, the FAA had actually considered a terrorist hijacking in the US as a potential threat. But since neither hijacking nor a bombing had happened in over a decade, they concluded that their system was working. NORAD had also discussed planning for scenarios where a hijacked plane was guided towards targets of interest to the US. But these scenarios were only for flights originating from international destinations like the Middle East, where hijackings were pretty common, and they failed to plan for a scenario originating domestically. Intelligence is the most important of the steps because when it fails, pre-screening is also less accurate. And this was definitely the case on 9/11, where the FAA's no-fly list had only 12 people on it at the time. They could have used a list based off of data from the State Department's tip-off system, but they chose not to. Sadly, this list was a lot more thorough, and in fact, it had identified 2 of the 19 hijackers. Additionally, travelers selected by the CAP system, which was a system that flagged potentially dangerous passengers for additional security, only implemented the extra security for these individuals on their checked baggage. There was no additional screening for their carry-on luggage or for the person themselves. 4 out of the 9 hijackers were flagged by CAPS, but because they carried on their weapons through their person or their carry-on luggage, the CAP system was of no use. Since pre-screening didn't give hijackers away, they went through the checkpoint as normal. And there were FAA guidelines for what was dangerous and should have been allowed through the checkpoint, but contractors were told to use common sense, and it was at their discretion. The hijackers are thought to have used items like box cutters and pepper spray, which could have easily been cleared through the checkpoint. So the screening on 9/11 failed as well. On 9/11, airport access wasn't really an issue, and as I just said, checked bags weren't an issue, and neither was cargo security. So the last step to secure the aircraft was onboard security, which had 2 elements. The first was having law enforcement on board, which would be air marshals, but by 2001, there were only 33 air marshals working domestically for more than 20,000 daily flights. The second was a common strategy for flight crews dealing with in-air threats, but they were trained not to try and thwart hijackers and instead to comply and convince them to land safely. because of 9/11, many policy changes were made, and today the Transportation Security Administration runs aviation security rather than the FAA and the airlines. They are under the umbrella of the Department of Homeland Security, meaning that they share intelligence with numerous other agencies. Tip-off data is used to make a better no-fly list. A CAPS version 2 was implemented so that selectees have increased personal, carry-on, and checked baggage screening. The number of screeners was doubled to 46,000, all of whom are federal employees with lots of training. Approximately 5,000 to 7,000 air marshals work today. The actual number is classified, but it's still better than 33. There are better bag and body scanners as well as explosive residue detectors that are in place at every airport. Cockpit doors are now armed, and flight crews are trained in defensive tactics. There are so many other security measures in place, but a lot of them are classified so that potential terrorists can't plan to evade them. But this all begs the question, how well have these changes to aviation security worked out? On paper, the TSA has done a great job. There has not been a single death on a flight leaving from a U.S. airport since 9/11 as a result of terrorism, which is awesome. In fact, in the same time period, there has not even been a single attempted terrorist attack on a flight leaving from U.S. soil. All of the flights have been originating from abroad, such as the shoe bomber or the underwear bomber. In 2016 alone, TSA seized 2,500 guns from carry-on luggage, 83% of which were loaded. And all of this would suggest that planes and airports have fantastic security. Despite these apparent successes, however, there are still concerns. A 2015 test of TSA done by the Department of Homeland Security reported that they failed to detect mock weapons in 95% of tests done by undercover agents. In 2016, the test was repeated with the same result, and in 2017, the test showed improvement, but 70% of mock weapons were still missed. These tests shows that there are still major concerns regarding aviation security, and attacks at the Brussels and Istanbul airports, which have occurred outside of the security zone, beg the question as to how safe we actually are. We have absolutely improved, but how can U.S. aviation security be even better? I'm going to play a clip about Israeli aviation security, which we could possibly follow or implement some of these procedures.
No airplane leaving from Tel Aviv's Ben Gurion Airport has ever been hijacked or bombed. It's been attempted, but this airport's security is simply nearly impenetrable. What's most fascinating is that this airport is hardly using any super advanced technology. They use the exact same metal detectors as the US and Europe, but they focused on the human factor. Israel has come to realize that it's unfortunately easy to get weapons through airport security. Plastic explosives, non-metallic knives, and blunt weapons are just tough to detect. So rather than focusing on the weapons that could be used for an attack, they focus on the people who could use them. At Ben Gurion Airport, security starts before passengers even get to the airport. Cars pass through a security checkpoint a mile away from the airport entrance, where guards inspect cars and look for any suspicious-looking individuals. The minute passengers arrive at the airport, they're being watched already. Highly trained plainclothes officers roam around in the check-in area, again searching for individuals acting abnormally or nervous. Then, before passengers are even allowed to check in, there's the interview. Anyone who's passed through Ben Gurion Airport knows how intense this interview is, but it's likely the single greatest factor leading to the safety of Israeli airports. Passengers are first asked standard questions like what their jobs are, why they came to Israel, how long they stayed for, and if they packed their own bags, and all the while, the security agent watches the passenger's face for reactions. They'll also probe deeper, asking why the passenger has been to various countries stamped in their passport. They'll then ask oddly specific questions: which school they went to, when they last moved, what kind of car they have. These are all to see if the passenger is being honest about who they are. If a security officer senses hesitation or finds a hole in their story, they could deem the passenger a higher risk. Once passengers have completed their interview, a barcode is placed on the back of their passport that starts with a number from 1 to 6. If it starts with 1, the passenger is deemed a very low risk. This is almost only given to Israeli citizens, while if it starts with 6, the passenger is deemed a very high risk and will be subjected to extremely thorough screening. While a lot of the risk determination has to do with the interview, profiling also plays into it. According to the Israeli security system, passengers are deemed higher risk if they are male, if they are traveling alone, if they are young, and most of all, if they are Arab. Western non-Israeli individuals are also generally considered to be a higher security risk, typically receiving a 4 or 5. After the interview, passengers are finally allowed to check in. Their checked bags are put through a standard X-ray and then are placed in a pressure chamber. The chamber's pressure is lowered to the level of pressurized aircraft, about the equivalent of 6,000 to 8,000 feet of altitude, to set off any explosives designed to trigger when a plane's cabin pressure is lower at cruising altitude. Meanwhile, the passenger passes through a standard X-ray or body scanner. This physical screening process is exactly the same as it would be in North America, Europe, or Asia. They just walk through the scanners and grab their bags. Those deemed a higher security risk, above 3 or 4, likely would have their bags manually searched, and then the highest risk individuals, 5 or 6s, are often taken aside for another round of questioning and a pat-down. The security doesn't even stop when passengers board the plane. Like the US, Israel has a system of air marshals, armed security guards on planes. But unlike the US, at least in the case of El Al, Israel's national airline, there are air marshals on every single flight. They sit among the passengers, often near any that were identified at the airport as high risk, and they have alert buttons that communicate with the pilots in case of an attempted hijacking. If the marshals press this button, an alarm will go off in the cockpit, and the pilots will often send the plane into a dive to knock the hijacker off their feet. This technique has successfully prevented terror attacks in the past. These air marshals secure the plane from the inside, but another system protects the outside. El Al's planes are installed with thermal flares that deploy when a radar detects an incoming missile. Thermal-guided missiles will then target the flares instead of the plane. El Al and the other Israeli airlines also stay.
So, Israel clearly does a very good job at aviation security, but at what capacity would the US realistically be able to implement these measures? My first concern is that they use severe racial profiling and they pose a threat to civil liberties and American values. I actually went to Israel this summer, and my experience definitely confirmed that the racial profiling there is out of this world. So, the first weird question I was asked during my interview was, "What holidays do you celebrate?" I was tired and being sarcastic, so I said American ones, like the 4th of July. And she followed up with, "But what winter holiday?" At which point I realized she was trying to ask me what religion I was, and I wasn't thrilled about that, so I said, "I celebrate New Year's Eve." Despite my evasive questioning, though, I still got a number 1, meaning that I was the lowest risk for security, which is odd because I had stamps on my passport from Sri Lanka, Lebanon, as well as a visa from Jordan. And these were not something that made me a risk. However, there was a kid on my program from Tulane who had never left the US, but he had dark skin, and so he was given a 6, and it took him 3 hours to get through security. In addition to the questions of civil liberties and racial profiling, Ben Gurion is pretty small. It's only about the size of the San Diego airport, and it's the only major airport in Israel. So I wonder whether or not the US could scale up to follow the Israeli model, not only because it's difficult and takes a lot of manpower, but it would also be extremely expensive. And I wonder if that extra money would be worth it or whether we could use it elsewhere to pay for something like universal health care that also saves lives. The TSA's average cost per life saved is $667 million, which is how much money it spent to stop one human death. Whereas Medicaid's cost per averted death is only about $1 million. So I think it's a fair discussion to have as to how we should spend our money to keep people safe and alive, especially given that the airplane is empirically the safest way to travel. Drivers of cars have a 1 in 114 chance of dying in a motor vehicle crash, whereas you only have a 1 in 9,821 chance of dying from an air transit accident. Despite this, however, fear of flying due to the threat of an attack after 9/11 is off the charts. In fact, surveys show that 6% of travelers annually choose to drive to their destinations rather than to fly because they are afraid. A University of Michigan study found that reassurance of security provided by TSA arguably saves 300 lives per month by getting people off of the roads and having them instead fly to their destination. Put in different terms, terrorists can kill 300 people per month by scaring us off of airplanes. In conclusion, 9/11 has changed aviation security as we know it, but we've adapted, and though the new system is not perfect, it is doing its job. Unless something major changes, it may not be worth the money spent to try and make airport security even better than it already is today. But that's just my opinion, and I think that's up for yourselves and our country to decide. So thank you for listening. I really appreciate it.